In this video, we're going to take a look at CO2 control and CO2 alarms. Let's open up our Add a Function dialog, and here we can see that there are two function blocks related to CO2 control, the standard CO2 function block and the CO2 alarm function block. Let's add in a standard CO2 control first. Let's open up our CO2 control, and here we can see our standard rules. The rules contain a set point for our ppm and a deadband. Let's take a look at our equipment tab. On this tab we can see that we have a CO2 sensor selection, a mode selection, and then an output that we want to control. The CO2 function also has an option to enable a main CO2 valve. If we want, we can select a device in order to control a main valve here. So the first step is generally selecting the CO2 sensor that we want to use. Let's take a look at the devices that we have in this room. We can see we have an SXG CO2 gas sensor. This is designed to be mounted on the wall about 1 foot from the floor and is typically used in alarming functions. We also have our standard SXC environment sensor in the room that has the temperature, humidity, and light reading as standard, and is also available with a precision CO2 sensor, as well as a downward-looking infrared temperature sensor to measure the plant canopy. Finally, we get VPD from this sensor. The environment sensor is the standard sensor that's used for controlling CO2. So that's the sensor we're going to select in our CO2 control function block. Next, we need to select a mode. In this case, we're going to be doing standard CO2 injection. If we want, we can enable the option to disable CO2 when the sensor does not detect light. Finally, we need to select an output which will control the CO2 on and off. So we'll select an on-off output type. In this case, we're going to select our RX1, which we've named CO2. RX1 is a single outlet controller that we can plug a CO2 solenoid valve or similar device into. So we've selected our environment sensor, we're going to be doing injection, and we're going to be controlling this RX1 outlet. Now let's go back over to our Rules tab and configure our set points. In this case, let's say we want a 1200 ppm target, and we're going to allow a 200 ppm drift or deadband from the target. Here we can see a preview of how that will work. Once we press the Save button, our rule will go into effect. We can see that the dot has turned green, and we can see that our CO2 relay has activated. If we go back over to the Devices tab in our room, we can see that this outlet module has turned on. Now if we want, we can create additional CO2 rules and change these set points to allow the CO2 set point to change over time. For example, we could say from day 1 through day 7, we have this particular set point. Now we can copy this rule, make day 8 through 14 be a different set point. Okay, and now we can look back through our different rules and see the different set points. Now you'll see that neither of these rules are currently active because we are currently beyond day 14 in this particular room. That covers the basics of CO2 control. Now let's take a look at the CO2 alarm function block. Let's add a CO2 alarm to the workspace, open it up. The CO2 alarm function block does not contain any scheduling features and is a continuous alarm set point. Here we can see what the default alarm and safe levels are set to. These can be changed if desired. Let's take a look at the Equipment tab and see what we can configure here. There are a lot of different components that can go into a CO2 alarm. The first is, of course, the CO2 sensor. As we mentioned before, the SXG gas sensor is the most appropriate sensor for CO2 alarms. If we have a CO2 sensor in the room in our environment sensor, we can select that here. If we want to activate exhaust fans, we can select an output to enable in order to operate the exhaust fans. Finally, if we have AXG horn strobes, we can select those here. AXG horn strobes are a combined horn and strobe module and also contain a dry contact in order to activate external alarms, buzzers, lights, etc. We can select up to 2 of these horn strobe modules, one for inside the room and one for outside the room. Additionally, we can select the CO2 valve that is controlling the CO2 in that room. This will allow us to automatically disable the CO2 if the alarm gets activated. Of course, that CO2 valve is already being used by our CO2 control function block. So, to recap our CO2 alarm function block, we have a primary CO2 sensor, a secondary CO2 sensor, an option for exhaust fans. The exhaust fans will operate anytime the function block is activated, and the function block can be activated by the set point on the rules tab, which is the alarm level, or it can be activated by a purge button, which is connected to the horn strobe module. Either horn strobe module can have a purge or alarm button that is manually pressed. When that button is manually pressed, it will operate the alarm function here, turning on the exhaust fans and the horn strobe modules and disabling the CO2 valve. It will operate that way until it gets to the safe level. At that point, the exhaust fans, horn strobes will be disabled and the CO2 valve will be allowed if called for. This completes the configuration of the CO2 alarm function block. We would press save to confirm our changes, and we would see a gray dot. If the alarm is functioning and activated, this will be green, as well as the perimeter around the function block itself. This concludes the configuration of CO2 control on the GCX control system.